Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Rachel Whalen. Rachel is a writer and translator from Buffalo, New York. She earned her MFA in creative writing from NYU in 2021 and her BA in English from Cornell in 2019. She speaks English, Spanish, Italian, and a little bit of Russian and lives with her partner in Mexico City. We're delighted to be with her today. First-time listeners, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're building a community of writers and artists from all walks of life, and since you're with us on this journey, we'd appreciate if you would like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover or a guest you want us to bring on, please let us know. And for more free resources, check out the Datekeepers blog at thedatekeepers.com/blog. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you both so much for having me. I am a writer from Buffalo, New York. I studied English and Spanish at Cornell, and after that did an MFA at NYU in creative writing, like specifically in poetry. And then shortly after that, moved to Mexico, which is where I live now in Mexico City. Although I studied poetry, I have sort of since branched out into other forms, more recently essays and plays, or longer form fiction a little bit as well. And I've also been writing a lot more in Spanish recently. I'm also a translator, so that really affects a lot of the work that I do. And in Spanish, I'm finding myself in Spanish writing more poetry and sort of gravitating towards shorter forms in Spanish more so than in English. But yeah.
It takes a lot to get to the level in a foreign language where you are comfortable writing in it. When did you reach that level, and what was it like crossing that threshold?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the beautiful things about living in another language, like it's the language I use mostly every day in my day-to-day life with people that I live around, is that you're always like learning things and growing from within that language. So I'm still learning Spanish. I'm still learning new phrases and new words all the time. And I think that's, as a writer who's fascinated by like linguistics and language, that's really exciting. I took a writing workshop when I first moved here in mini fiction, like sometimes, short prose poems or stories that can be as short as one sentence and as long as like a page. And that was all in Spanish. And I was absolutely terrified when I started doing that workshop. But, I think I realized that, the workshop was a really supportive place. And I realized that, if I was like slightly wrong in a certain grammatical sense, it wasn't a big deal. And that, it was really like a celebration of ideas and creativity, I think. The complexities of working in a different language like is really challenging, but also in a way really liberating.
I encourage you to be proud of everything that you have accomplished when it comes to writing in other languages or reading in other languages. I write and read and speak in many languages. I mainly do English now, but it's challenging, but it's a lot of fun. Do you have an example of an idiom that you translated and it really doesn't make sense, or even it's funny sometimes?
Oh, that's a good question too. Man, there are so many that don't work exactly, word for word in either English or Spanish. One that I really like that I often find myself trying to say in English, when I'm speaking and it doesn't quite make sense is if you say it in Spanish, le di al avión. Really, it means like I gave him the airplane or something, like word for word, it means that. But it kind of means like if someone's talking to me and I tuned him out or I tuned her out, I would say, le di al avión, like I didn't even pay attention to what they were saying. No? but expressions like that, idioms like that, I think really enrich me, in many senses, but also, especially as a writer, like I think just having new ways of thinking, new ways of saying those kinds of expressions help me expand like my linguistic like skills and ways of writing as well.
Did you notice any differences in the workshop culture, like the creative writing workshop culture in Mexico as opposed to in the United States?
I guess my experience, a lot of my experiences in workshops in the United States are in a more formal setting, like especially with the MFA. There's a sense of, I don't know, there's a sense of like seriousness, I would say, at least in my experience with the MFA, of like, we're writers, like we're doing, like, this is serious stuff, you know? And I think, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just quite a different environment and it kind of yields different results, I think, sometimes. But in my experience, in my limited experience, I should say, in the workshop I took in Mexico City, it wasn't for anyone who was specifically studying literature. Like, there were people who were scientists and working in all different fields, who were just like loved writing and wanted to write. And I think that in itself made it a lot less intense. Like, I think it was just a lot more open to new ideas, a lot more just fun, like just playing around with language and ideas. And I think I really appreciated that perspective in the workshops I've taken here in Mexico.
And when did you start writing, and what made you decide that you wanted to become a writer?
I've always, like, since I can remember, I've always loved writing and stories, and reading. And I have a specific memory of being in, in third grade, and shout out to my third grade teacher who saw this essay I wrote about like Abraham Lincoln or something. It was like a 1-page essay, and she was like, "You're going to be a writer. Like, I'm going to be reading your work when you're a professional writer someday." And I don't know how, or like, I don't know how she came to that conclusion, but in my 8-year-old brain, it made me feel like, oh, I actually could do this. I actually could like dedicate my life to this. So all throughout high school and throughout college, I really loved writing. And I think in college, I sort of specifically fell in with the poetry crowd, and that sort of pushed me a little closer towards poetry at that moment. And I think that's why I specifically pursued a poetry MFA. But yeah, there've been like a lot of turns and I think developments in my writing over time. But it all started a long time ago when I was in third grade, I would say.
And moving to another country is not always easy. How did you decide to move to Mexico? And do you have a group of writers or artists or just friends to exchange ideas with? What was that experience like? Maybe your first day, or if you have a story to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I was finishing the MFA in New York City, I was, on the job hunt, and I found a job that would take me to Mexico City. I was also kind of looking for jobs in Mexico City, then not exclusively, but that one happened to work out. I should preface that by saying that at NYU, I had really gotten into translating. I had studied Spanish pretty much my whole life, but in and NYU, there are two MFA programs. There's one in English and one in Spanish. And I was always kind of stunned by the lack of like connectivity the two programs had. So a good friend of mine, Enrique Silva, who's also a wonderful writer, we both sort of started a translation thing there where we were translating works by writers in both programs in order to sort of build a bridge between the two. And he's from Mexico City, so we always kind of joked that we like swapped swapped places. But when he and I started that program, I just really got excited about writing in Spanish and building sort of a creative community in Mexico. And so that's kind of what led me on the journey to look for jobs in Mexico City. And when I did get a job in Mexico City, I moved in October of 2021. And it was definitely a challenge at first. I think, moving to any new city is a big deal, but especially in another language, there are a lot of words and phrases that I was still learning, especially in like a colloquial level. So it was a big learning curve, I'd say, at the outset, but I do feel like really grateful. And, my closest friends or many of my closest friends are Mexican, and really helped me sort of find my community here. Many of them are also very creative, a lot of them from that workshop I mentioned that I took sort of early on in my time in Mexico City. So yeah, I do feel really lucky to have built a creative community over the years, and I feel even luckier that it seems to keep growing as I meet new people here.
And what do you write about? What themes or topics?
Yeah, recently I've been writing, I guess, about family a lot, or like relationships that I have. Usually politics sort of trickles in because I think about political things a lot. But the first essay I wrote this year that sort of started a string of essays that I've been writing was about my cat getting out. Essentially, my cat like got lost, and that situation sort of led us on this very strange odyssey and trying to look for him. And it was just so many ideas and so many sort of things happening in that time that I felt like it couldn't all fit in a poem. Like I just felt like it had to be a bit longer. That sort of started like that's reflection on that. experience and sort of the connections, the strange sort of unexpected connections I made with my neighbors and like the process for searching him, or with other people who had also lost cats, for example, made me start writing that essay. And since then, I've been writing, I guess, a lot about points of connectivity and relationships with people in my life, whether it's family members or friends or my partner. Like, I think I've been thinking a lot about what those relationships mean in the modern era and sort of how to navigate being a young adult in the world we live in, and the relationships I've constructed in the last couple of years.
And how did you meet your partner?
We actually met in that creative writing class. He was the instructor here in Mexico City for that workshop I mentioned. He, at the time, was the instructor, and I was the student or one of the students. And since then, we became really good friends. For about a year and a half, we were really close friends, and after that, we started dating. So. Yeah, he's also a really fantastic writer, and I also really enjoyed translating his works. That's been something that's been really sort of a special point of connection for us. Like, translating his voice into English has been a really fascinating way to, I feel like, get to know each other better too.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I think it's we also really inspire each other a lot in terms of, like, he's always the first person to read what I write, and vice versa. And also sometimes those points of communication, or I wouldn't say failures in communication, but like, if I'm searching for a word in Spanish or a phrase in Spanish that I can't think of, I'll just like translate it literally from English, and he'll kind of look at me like, whoa, like what was that? And those funny moments will often lead to a poem, or, poems or stories, or playing with language in a literary way, as well as like within our dynamic together as well.
Those are my favorite. Can I share the sock story?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so just for some context here, Ita's normally like just amazing with idioms, like to the point where I'll know that she's tuned in because one day I will use or an idiom will be used in our vicinity that I don't think she's used or heard before because I've never heard her say it. And a day or two later, it'll just pop out of her mouth, fully formed, and it's always either exactly correctly used or it's misused in a way that is a plausible misinterpretation of what the idiom means based on the context. So
Yeah.
that's her baseline. Like her idiom is like the way she picks them up. It's magical. But every now and then there's an exception to that. And and the other day she was trying to express that she wasn't really impressed by something, and she said, "Well, that didn't make me remove my socks." And I said, "Do you mean it didn't knock your socks off?" And she said, "Yeah, no, it didn't. It did not."
Oh, that's fantastic. And those moments are so wonderful. I feel like there's such fascinating explorations of language, and also like your relationship as a couple, just like exploring language together. I love that. That's a fantastic story. I feel like those like delightful moments are so or I imagine they're common in like a lot of bilingual or multilingual relationships. So it happens like somewhat frequently that, I won't understand something or I'll need some clarification. But one example that sort of affected me in, I guess, a literary way was, I think it was about 2 years ago. My partner's name is Atsa, and he was, I don't know, like complimenting me or something. And I said, I wanted to say, "You're going to give me a big head," like, like the term big head in English. But I didn't quite know how to say that exactly in Spanish. So I just said like, me estás dando una cabezota. Like I just said literally like, you're giving me a cabezota, like a big head. And he kind of looked at me like, what? Like, what does that mean? So I had to like pause and sort of explain it. But since then, like that word cabezota has become a part of our vocabulary together. Like, just, I don't know, if I'm worrying about something, like I'll just say, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I have a cabezota." Like we just kind of our like day-to-day language. And I sort of began to, we started using it all the time. And I began to think like, wouldn't it be weird or like interesting if there was this person, like a character who like literally just had a ginormous head? Like, how would he put on a hat or like get through the doorway, or like how would he navigate these quotidian situations? And that sort of became like, I started writing a sort of a project of mini fictions, I guess you could say, of in Spanish, of like that kind of character. And that was just a really funny sort of project that started with that simple like misunderstanding.
So who are some of your favorite authors?
Man, that's always so complicated because there's so many. But recently, well, I think an author that recently really changed my life was Juan Rulfo, who's this like fantastic Mexican writer that I just highly recommend everyone like drop everything and read him immediately because he's so wonderful and poetic, I think, in his prose. He wrote this really seminal text called Pedro Paramo, which is like a really key text in the sort of development of magical realism. He also wrote this really interesting short story collection, among many other things, but called El Llano en Llamas, which is some of the most poetic prose I've ever come across. It's what kind of got me interested or thinking that I could potentially start writing more prose as well, but just like breathtaking. Like every sentence is packed with incredible language. And then there's this other Uruguayan writer that I've been like interested in for a little while, named Mario Lebrero. And he's mostly a novelist, but he wrote this fascinating book called Casa de Conejos, which is like literally would be like rabbit hunting. And it's kind of like a book of mini fictions as well about literally just this group of people who go to hunt rabbits. But it's so interesting the way he changes each mini fiction to like throw a new light on the situation. It's hilarious. It's chaotic. I think it's sort of political in certain moments as well. But those are two names that come to mind that I've been sort of obsessed with recently.
If you could go back and choose again whether or not to go through your MFA program, would you choose to do it or would you choose a different path?
Man, that's such a good question. And I think a hard one to answer because I've definitely thought about it. I guess I'll say, like, I think the MFA has so many pros and also it has some like strange elements to it as well. I think the pros for me have been so important, and especially thinking about the friendships and relationships I've built from the MFA, who are like people who are some of my closest friends and often my first readers. You know, if I write something and feel like I need another set of eyes on it, that's my like those handful of people, maybe 2 or 3 from the MFA are like my go-to community in that sense. I think the weirder things about it, and again, this is definitely my personal experience in my situation. You know, I'm sure every MFA experience is different, but I think sometimes I had this feeling that we had to write a certain way or reach a certain milestone for this, you know, to count as writers, which I certainly don't believe anymore. You know, I think in the MFA, I went into it thinking like, okay, this structure, you know, this intense workshop system or whatever is what I need to be a writer. You know, that's all I wanted. And I had sort of tunnel vision towards that. And then one of my professors, his name is Matt Rohr, he's also a really excellent poet, gave me this incredible advice that I think about all the time, which was like pursuing happiness like is the best way to be a writer. You know, like being happy, you know, is when he told me being happy was when he wrote like most prolifically and the work he liked the most. And maybe, of course, you know, we should all be pursuing happiness for happiness sake. But sometimes I've really had to remind myself, like taking a break from writing, taking a break from like obsessing about a certain project to go hang out with friends or to be with family, like that pursuing happiness is a necessary component to, in my view, to being a writer and to pursuing writing. And the MFA, I feel like sometimes is a weird counterweight to that. Like it just feels sometimes too institutionalized to ever recognize that kind of thing.
Well, that's interesting advice too, because when you think of writers, you don't usually think of a bunch of happy people.
Yeah, exactly. Like
It's good advice. I agree. I think my best work has been done when I'm happy, and Ito's a little bit of an outlier in that she is someone whose default setting is happiness, even in spite of everything that she's been through. Happiness is a very valuable state to cultivate, even just instrumentally treating it as a vehicle for getting to good writing. Even in that respect, it's still valuable.
right.
But it is a little bit counterintuitive because we've been conditioned to the romantic notion of the emotionally tortured artist. So refreshing and a little bit unorthodox to hear someone say, no, just try to be happy and that'll help.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly what you're saying. You know, the idea that, oh, like the writer's like this brooding, sad figure. Of course, you know, if I'm sad, sometimes writing helps me work through a certain problem. But I feel like writing requires energy. You know, it requires like mental calmness in order to understand like what you're trying to say. And I feel like in my personal experience, you know, I've been able to do that best when I'm happy, you know, when I'm able to step back and, you know, really dedicate that mental energy towards writing something.
We always ask guests to read from their work. Would you like to read something for us?
Yeah, of course. I'll read the beginning of an essay. The essay that was published actually alongside Yorsito and Lens Ticket, which you're absolutely fantastic, by the way. I absolutely like fell in love with your essay. It was so like humorous and had so many levels to it. I like fell in love with it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. But yeah, so I'll read a bit from the essay on Lens Ticket called On Insignificance. As we bombed Iran, my cat got out. On TVs in the cantinas and fondas of Mexico City, the war reels played. Iran, Israel, United States, nuclear threat, blockades, Palestinians, Gaza, mass starvation. Stateside, shaky footage of ICE officers razing entire communities to the ground. In my new home in Mexico, behind suited men serving orange slices and mezcal, behind swishing plates of chilaquiles and blue corn tortillas, the broadcast showed my country once again suffocating the world, snuffing it out, shattering people and places into oblivion. And I was worried about Fidel. It occurred to me that he had left in anticipation, a sort of fleeing before the end times. It occurred to me that he could detect this final ebb, that he could understand something barely registered at the edge of my consciousness. His absence was the blank future chilling me cold. I had expected to watch him grow for 2 decades, and after only 1 year, he was gone. I couldn't help but draw parallels to the present and looming disasters that shouted from every newspaper stand lining the streets of Santa Maria la Ribera. My privileged perch presiding over the life of something I loved was replaced by a front seat view into the abyss. I had never been a cat person. After growing up with dogs, I found cats to be standoffish and almost cruelly apathetic. I didn't see the point of caring for an animal that would not reciprocate my attention, and I had only ever met cats that were at worst aggressive and at best indifferent. I feigned doting over my friends' cats while harboring a thinly veiled disdain for them. So it was a surprise to everyone, perhaps to me most of all, when I decided to adopt Fidel. At first, we didn't understand each other. For the first months of his life, I thought he was female until, surprise, the vet told me otherwise on the day of Mexico's Pride celebration, no less. He was wary of my comparatively massive body, and I was terrified of his animal instincts. Would he bolt? Would he hide? Would he lash out at a moment's notice? But little by little, in the year that followed, we created a language together. Unintentionally, I learned how to register each of his vocalizations and know what they meant, and he could respond to my cues, make me laugh, curl onto my lap when I was sad. I cared for him, and I learned that taking care of something is perhaps the purest expression of love that there is. In return, he provided me with his humorous and affectionate company. I was on vacation when my fiancé told me that Fidel had gotten out and couldn't be found. Suddenly, the beautiful places I was seeing and the warmth of my friend's presence became imperceptible. My generally anxious demeanor bled into moments of panic. I began looking for him the minute I arrived home. My days revolved around searching. I scoured the internet for tips. I called all of the vets in our area. I posted online. I put up and passed out over 100 flyers. I bought a humane trap and placed his food in it as bait. In the mornings and at night, I crouched down to look under cars with my flashlight, hoping to see 2 dots shining back at me. Raised Catholic, I naturally began my search each day at dawn with a prayer to St. Anthony. Having distanced myself from the church, I did not know if this was appropriate. I had not had regular correspondence with St. Anthony or his colleagues since high school. It seemed almost impertinent to turn to him now in a time of desperation when I had rebuffed him and his fraternity for my entire adult life. But I nonetheless reopened our line of communication, hoping that my appeals would be heard and that somehow Fidel would appear outside my door. As the week went on, I began to feel more and more desperate. One day, while tearing up over coffee with a close friend, I confessed that I felt exhausted and at a loss. "I've been looking this up," she said. "Have you tried asking street cats for help?" My confused look answered for me. She explained that, according to Japanese legend, an effective method for finding lost cats is to converse with strays. You talk to them as though they're humans, asking them to pass on the message that your cat is loved and needed at home. I thought this over. It sounded unreasonable, but it also didn't seem like that much more of a stretch than asking a dead guy from the 13th century for help. In the days that followed, with no sign of Fidel, I felt myself spiraling into a familiar feeling of depression and self-directed anger. I started to berate myself over the tiniest things. I'd wake up at 5 a.m., my heart pounding against my chest. I completely lost my appetite. I taped flyers to telephone poles and lampposts with a devastating feeling of futility. As I made my way home, dozens of his photocopied eyes peered back at me. "If you see Fidel, tell him to come home," I said to a gray and white cat fanned out on the sidewalk. She blinked long and slow. I took this to mean that she would. The post-COVID world had pushed me indoors. For the past 4 years, I have worked from home. This has rendered me skittish in conversations with strangers or in new social settings. I had grown accustomed to the world being predominantly in my head or on the news, stepping foot outside only for an occasional evening errand or outing with friends. I was still spending most of my time in my apartment. Like Fidel, whose physical environment consisted solely of my sofas and bedspreads, I was beginning to experience my domestic life as the bulk of my life. This made it embarrassing to leave the house several times a day to search for him. I didn't know how to present myself or my plight. I felt awkward approaching strangers and neighbors to ask for help. I was painfully conscious of my own voice, my body, my presence intruding upon their days. It reminded me of when I had gone campaigning in the past, but at least then I was advocating for political leaders I believed would make a difference. I'd gone door to door in labyrinthian Brooklyn apartment complexes, engaging in impassioned discourse about the importance of healthcare for all and secure public housing. Now I was just a woman looking for her cat. This could not be less important for the world, I thought, as I handed vendors and neighbors my half sheet with Fidel's picture and my phone number. Yet every night that I went home without him, I sobbed myself to sleep. How can we justify minute losses in the context of global disaster? How could I worry about Fidel when entire peoples were being destroyed, entire families eliminated? Since 2023, I had felt gripped with paralysis in the escalation of the Palestinian genocide. I'd gone to marches, I'd put up posters, but the unceasing minutiae of my daily life surged absurdly forward. I traveled, I got engaged, my partner and I began planning our wedding. My moments of intense joy seemed grotesque when I watched the news, just as the disappearance of Fidel felt both excruciating and unimportant. And if his loss, something that tightened my chest in panic, was unimportant, then wasn't I as well? Quickly, I fell into a pit of self-hatred. I wanted to get out of my head, my skin. I felt like I didn't deserve to be sad, but I was. Therefore, I didn't deserve to feel better, so why try? It was a steep escalation into my own private disaster, my calamity of insignificance. And I can stop there. Thank you guys both so much for having me. I really appreciate the interview. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of the podcast. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.